Have you ever heard of the invisible generation? They're the demographic cohort that's smaller than the two giants it's sandwiched between. They were the last kids to have an analog childhood and the first to experience a digital adulthood. And they created a culture of beautiful, sarcastic apathy. Today, we're talking about Generation X. Hello, Sunnies, and welcome back to Sunny English Bite. I'm your host, Sunny.
And I'm Alex, and today we are pulling back the curtain on Generation X, the so-called invisible generation sandwiched between the baby boomers and the millennial.
That's right. It's usually the baby boomers with their massive cultural and economic influence and the millennials who grew up with the internet. They seem to get all the media attention. Sunnies, is this true in your country too? Which generations get talked about the most? Let us know.
Exactly. But what about the generation that's stuck right in the middle, the so-called invisible generation?
Today, we are pulling back the curtain on Generation X. For our Sunnies, the expression to pull back the curtain means to reveal something that was hidden or secret. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to explore why Gen X just might be the most misunderstood generation of our time.
So, Sonny, let's start with the basics. Who exactly belongs to Generation X?
Great question. Generally, demographers say Gen Xers were born between 1965 and 1980. As you said, Alex, they're sandwiched between the massive boomer population and the equally massive millennial generation.
Right, and that's a key part of their story. They're a smaller generation, numerically, so they often get overlooked. But what really defines them is their unique place in history.
They were the last generation to have a fully analog childhood.
Think about that. No internet, no smartphones, no social media. Your friends were the kids who lived on your street. But then, as they entered the workforce, the digital revolution exploded. Their adulthood is completely digital.
That experience is so unique. It shaped everything about them, starting with their childhood. This brings us to a fantastic English expression, latchkey kids.
Yes, the latchkey kids. For our Sunnies learning English, a latchkey is just a key to your house. The term became popular because many Gen X kids came home from school to an empty house.
Exactly. This was a time of huge social change. More women were entering the workforce and divorce rates were rising, so kids had hours of unsupervised time after school.
My older cousin is a classic Gen Xer, and he has so many stories about this. He said by the time he was 10, he was responsible for walking his little sister home from school, making them both a snack, usually something questionable involving a toaster, and starting his homework before his parents got home at 6 p.m. He basically had to be a mini adult.
That's a perfect example, and this fierce independence is a classic Gen X trait. But it can be a bit of a double-edged sword. For our Sunnies, this expression means something that has both positive and negative effects. On the one hand, it made them incredibly resourceful. On the other, it sometimes makes it hard for them to rely on others.
Without cell phones to check in or parents hovering over them, you had to make your own dinner, figure out your homework, and solve your own problems with your siblings.
Right. This created an incredible sense of independence and self-reliance. It's a core trait of Gen X. They learned from a young age that if something needs to be done, you have to do it yourself.
That's a very good point, and this independence definitely shaped their entire worldview, which can sometimes come across as cynical.
Yeah, they are often seen as skeptical or pessimistic, but you have to look at the world they grew up in. They grew up under the shadow of the Cold War. They saw the Challenger's space shuttle explode on live TV. They witnessed the start of the AIDS crisis and several major economic recessions. There was a lot of social upheaval and broken promises.
I had a Gen X boss once who was a perfect example of this. We were about to launch a huge project, and everyone was high-fiving and celebrating. My boss, she just quietly said, "Okay, great. Now let's spend the next hour talking about every single thing that could go wrong." It wasn't that she was negative, she was just incredibly prepared. She wanted us to have a plan for every disaster scenario.
That's a perfect illustration of defensive pessimism in action. It's not about being gloomy, it's about being resilient. What about you, Sunnies? Do you find this trait in yourself or in your Gen X friends or colleagues? We'd love to hear your perspective.
The idealistic promises of the 60s and 70s didn't quite match the reality of the 80s and 90s.
This led them to develop a mindset called defensive pessimism. It's a fantastic term. It means you lower your expectations to prepare for the worst-case scenario.
So it's not really negativity for its own sake. It's a practical survival strategy. Hope for the best, but expect and plan for the worst. It's realism, not cynicism.
Exactly. And this practical mindset creates a really interesting clash with our modern, hyper-public world of social media.
Oh, it's a huge clash. Gen X grew up in an era where privacy was the default. What you did was your own business. There wasn't this pressure to overshare, to post every meal, vacation, or emotion online.
Totally. They didn't grow up performing their lives for an audience. So for many of them, the culture of influencers and constant life updates is just bizarre.
Right. They might use social media, but often in a more reserved way, to connect with old friends or share major news. They're more likely to be observers and the stars of the show. Their identity isn't tied to likes or comments.
That realism we talked about also comes out in their humor. Gen X basically perfected the art of sarcasm and irony.
Absolutely. It's their signature communication style. Think of the culture they created in the 90s. Movies like Pulp Fiction, shows like Seinfeld or Friends. It's all built on witty, ironic, and sometimes sarcastic dialogue.
For them, humor is a shield. It's a coping mechanism. If you can make a dry joke about a stressful situation, it gives you a feeling of power over it.
That makes perfect sense. It's a way to acknowledge how absurd life can be without getting defeated by it. This can sometimes be misunderstood by other generations as being detached or negative, but it's often their way of connecting.
And you can't talk about Gen X without talking about the culture they created. It was a complete shift from what came before.
Oh, absolutely. Musically, they rejected the polished corporate rock of the 80s. They gave us grunge, bands like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden. It was raw, authentic, and full of angst.
And it wasn't just music, it was filmmaking too. Think about the rise of independent filmmakers in the 90s. Quentin Tarantino, Kevin Smith with his movie Clerks. They didn't wait for a big studio to give them permission. They just grabbed a camera and made their own art.
And it wasn't just music and film. It was the birth of indie video games, zines, the very beginning of internet culture. They had a DIY, do-it-yourself ethic about everything. If the mainstream wasn't giving them what they wanted, they'd just go create it themselves.
That raw authenticity carried over into movies too. The 90s saw the rise of independent filmmakers. Think about Quentin Tarantino with Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction, or Kevin Smith with Clerks. These weren't glossy Hollywood blockbusters. They were gritty, dialogue-heavy, and made on tiny budgets. That's so true. And it wasn't just music, it was also the golden age of independent film. Think about directors like Quentin Tarantino with Reservoir Dogs or Kevin Smith with Clerks. These weren't big, glossy Hollywood productions. They were gritty, low-budget films made by people who just had a story to tell. That music was a perfect soundtrack for their worldview. It wasn't optimistic, it was about grappling with disillusionment and finding a voice for their frustration. And it wasn't just music, right? The same ethos bled into movies. Okay, let's shift gears to the workplace. How does this independent, skeptical Gen Xer behave at work?
Their work ethic is really unique. Their boomer parents were often very loyal to a single company. They'd join a company and stay there for 40 years, hoping for a pension.
Right, the company man.
But Gen X saw that loyalty get betrayed. They saw their parents get laid off during recessions after decades of loyal service. So they learned a different lesson. Their loyalty isn't to a company, it's to their own competence.
That's a powerful distinction. Loyalty to competence. So they focus on building skills and getting the job done well, but they're not afraid to leave for a better opportunity.
Precisely. They pioneered the idea of work-life balance. They were the first generation to really push back and say, I'll work hard when I'm here, but my evenings and weekends are mine. They work to live, not live to work.
And this ties into their relationship with authority, right?
Yes, absolutely. A Gen Xer doesn't automatically respect someone just because they have a fancy title. Respect has to be earned through competence.
So they want a boss who actually knows what they're doing, not just someone who gives orders.
Exactly. They have a very low tolerance for incompetence from people in charge. They'll ask tough questions and challenge ideas they think are flawed, which older generations sometimes saw as disrespectful. But for a Gen X, it's about getting to the best outcome, not just following orders.
So we keep coming back to this theme of self-reliance. It's clearly one of their biggest strengths. They're resourceful, they're problem solvers.
Totally. You don't need to micromanage a Gen Xer. You can give them a problem and they'll go figure it out. But this strength has a flip side.
The flip side, what do you mean?
Well, because they're so used to handling things themselves, they can be really bad at asking for help.
Oh, that's a fascinating point. They might feel like it's a sign of weakness to admit they're struggling.
It can lead to a lot of hidden anxiety or burnout. They'll just put their heads down and try to power through a problem alone because that's what they've always done. This incredible independence can sometimes become isolating.
Which brings us to their role today. I love the term for Gen X as the bridge generation.
It's the perfect description. They are the human bridge between the old analog world and the new digital one.
They remember life before the internet. They used payphones and wrote letters, but they also adapted to and helped build the digital world. They were the first to use email at work, the first to build websites.
This dual experience gives them such a valuable perspective. They understand technology, but they aren't native to it. They remember a time before constant connectivity.
And you see this in how they parent. They try to find that balance for their kids. They want their children to be independent and to play outside, but they also know they need to be tech savvy.
It's a tough balancing act, but Gen X is uniquely positioned to handle it. They are the translators between the past and the future.
Wow, we've covered so much ground. So Gen X, not slackers or cynics, but resourceful, pragmatic, independent survivors who bridge two different worlds.
That sums it up pretty well. And now we want to hear from you, our amazing Sunnies. Are you a Gen Xer? Do you have Gen X family or friends? Does our description resonate with you?
Please share your stories and thoughts in the comments below. We truly read every single one and love learning from our global community.
And if you enjoyed this deep dive into culture and language, do us a favor and hit that thumbs up button. And be sure to subscribe to Sunny English Bites so you don't miss our next conversation.
Your support means the world to us. Thanks for tuning in today, everyone.
Until next time, Sunnies. Bye.